On April 11, 1951, at precisely 1 minute past midnight, General Douglas MacArthur received a message that would shatter the myth of military invincibility in American democracy. The five-star general, who had accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri, who had ruled occupied Japan like a modern shogun, who had led United Nations forces in Korea with the confidence of a man who believed himself beyond civilian control, was being fired. Not by another general, not by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but by a haberdasher's son from Missouri who had never graduated from college, Harry S. Truman. The telegram was brief, almost brutal in its simplicity, and it marked the culmination of a constitutional crisis that had been building for months, a collision between military ambition and civilian authority that would define the balance of power in American government for generations to come. This was not merely a personnel decision or a policy disagreement transformed into a firing. This was the moment when the 33rd President of the United States drew a line in history and declared that, in America, generals answer to presidents, not the other way around. The stakes could not have been higher, the consequences could not have been more profound, and the courage required could not have been more extraordinary, because MacArthur was not just any general, he was the most popular military figure in America, more beloved than Eisenhower, more revered than Patton, and Truman was the least popular president in modern polling history, with approval ratings that had plummeted to 23%. What possessed this unpopular president to take on this legendary general? What constitutional principle was worth risking everything? And how did this single act of presidential courage prevent the military from ever again threatening to supersede civilian control in the United States? If you've ever wondered how democracy survives its most dangerous moments, if you've ever questioned who really holds power when generals and presidents collide, then you need to hear this story. So hit that subscribe button right now, smash the like button to help others discover this crucial piece of history. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how fragile democratic institutions can be. And drop a comment telling us what surprises you most about this confrontation, because what happened next would test the very foundations of American constitutional government. The roots of this crisis reached back to June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, crashed across the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Truman, haunted by the memory of Hitler's unchecked aggression in the 1930s and determined not to repeat the mistakes of appeasement, made the decision to intervene without seeking a formal declaration of war from Congress. Instead, he characterized it as a police action under United Nations auspices, a semantic dodge that would establish a troubling precedent for future presidents but which seemed necessary in the moment to counter what he perceived as communist expansion. On July 8, 1950, Truman appointed Douglas MacArthur as commander of United Nations forces in Korea, a decision that seemed obvious at the time because MacArthur was already supreme commander of Allied powers in Japan, because he knew the region intimately, and because his reputation as a military genius was virtually unchallenged. MacArthur was 70 years old, vain, theatrical, brilliant, and utterly convinced of his own indispensability. He wore his distinctive corncob pipe and gold-braided cap like props in a carefully stage-managed performance of military greatness. He surrounded himself with sycophants who called him the greatest man alive. He gave interviews comparing himself to historical figures like Hannibal and Napoleon. And critically, dangerously, he believed that his military expertise gave him the right to make political decisions that were constitutionally reserved for civilian leadership. The general had spent the past 5 years ruling Japan with proconsular authority, answering to no one, implementing sweeping reforms, and being worshipped by millions of Japanese who saw him as their savior. This experience had inflated his already considerable ego to megalomaniacal proportions and had convinced him that he understood Asian affairs better than anyone in Washington, including the president. The first crack in the relationship appeared during the summer of 1950, when MacArthur traveled to Taiwan and met with Chiang Kai-shek, the exiled leader of nationalist China, without authorization from Washington. MacArthur's visit, which took place on July 31, 1950, alarmed Truman because it suggested American support for Chiang's dream of invading mainland China, a move that could expand the Korean conflict into a catastrophic world war. Truman, who was trying to maintain flexibility in America's China policy and who feared provoking the Soviet Union, was furious at MacArthur's freelancing. He sent W. Averell Harriman to Tokyo in early August to remind MacArthur that foreign policy was made in Washington, not in Tokyo. MacArthur listened politely and then largely ignored the message, issuing a statement to the veterans of foreign wars on August 20, 1950, that directly contradicted administration policy by arguing for a more aggressive stance toward communist China. Truman was so angry that he ordered Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson to have the statement withdrawn, but the damage was done. The general had publicly challenged presidential authority, and he had gotten away with it, which only emboldened him for future confrontations. Yet despite these warning signs, despite these early indications that MacArthur considered himself above civilian control, Truman needed the general because the war in Korea was going badly. North Korean forces had pushed United Nations troops into a tiny perimeter around the port city of Pusan, and only MacArthur's audacious amphibious landing at Incheon on September 15, 1950, turned the tide of the war and validated the general's reputation for military genius. The Incheon landing was a masterpiece of military planning and execution, a high-risk operation that MacArthur's own subordinates considered dangerously close to impossible. The harbor at Incheon had extreme tidal variations, up to 30 feet, meaning that ships could only approach during a brief window of high tide. The beaches were backed by seawalls that would require scaling ladders. The approach channels were narrow and easily defended. Every military expert who examined the plan declared it too risky, but MacArthur insisted, arguing with characteristic grandiosity that "we shall land at Incheon and I shall crush them." On September 15, 1950, the landing took place exactly as MacArthur had envisioned, catching North Korean forces completely by surprise and cutting their supply lines. Within 2 weeks, United Nations forces had recaptured Seoul, the South Korean capital, and North Korean forces were in full retreat. MacArthur's gamble had paid off spectacularly, and his reputation soared to even greater heights. Truman, relieved and grateful, flew halfway around the world to Wake Island in the Pacific to meet with MacArthur on October 15, 1950, in what would be their only face-to-face meeting. The encounter was cordial but revealing. MacArthur kept Truman waiting, arriving late in a calculated display of disrespect that shocked presidential aides. He refused to salute his commander-in-chief. He assured Truman that Chinese intervention in Korea was unlikely, stating with absolute confidence that if China did enter the war, their forces would face the greatest slaughter because they lacked air support. He promised that American troops would be home by Christmas. And he made it clear, through body language and tone if not through explicit words, that he considered this meeting an irritating interruption of his far more important work. Truman, ever gracious and perhaps not fully grasping the depth of MacArthur's insubordination, pinned a Distinguished Service Medal on the general's chest and flew back to Washington believing that the Korean War was nearly won. But MacArthur had made a catastrophic miscalculation, one that would cost thousands of lives and transform the nature of the conflict. On October 19, 1950, just 4 days after assuring Truman that Chinese intervention was unlikely, Chinese forces began crossing the Yalu River in massive numbers. By early November, as many as 300,000 Chinese soldiers had entered North Korea, hidden during daylight hours and moving at night to avoid American air reconnaissance. MacArthur had ignored intelligence warnings about Chinese troop movements, dismissing them as exaggerated or irrelevant, convinced that China would not dare challenge American military might. He had also ignored explicit instructions from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to use only South Korean troops in the provinces bordering China, instead sending American forces all the way to the Yalu River in what the Chinese perceived as a direct threat to their territory. When Chinese forces launched their massive offensive on November 25, 1950, they caught United Nations troops in an exposed position, strung out in mountainous terrain, vulnerable to encirclement and annihilation. The result was one of the worst military disasters in American history, a desperate fighting retreat through brutal winter conditions, with temperatures dropping to 30 degrees below zero, that became known as the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. American and South Korean forces suffered tens of thousands of casualties, and what had seemed like a war-winning advance turned into a desperate struggle for survival. MacArthur, rather than accepting responsibility for his strategic blunder, began calling for dramatic escalation of the war, demanding authority to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, to blockade the Chinese coast, and to use nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan to open a second front in mainland China. These proposals terrified Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff because they risked expanding the Korean conflict into World War III, potentially bringing the Soviet Union into direct combat with the United States at a time when both nations possessed atomic weapons. Throughout the winter of 1950 and into the spring of 1951, MacArthur conducted an increasingly public campaign to pressure Washington into adopting his more aggressive strategy. He gave interviews to journalists criticizing administration policy. He sent letters to members of Congress arguing for his approach. He made speeches suggesting that there was no substitute for victory, implying that Truman and his advisors lacked the courage to win the war. On March 7, 1951, he told reporters that the restrictions under which he was operating represented an enormous handicap without precedent in military history. On March 15, 1951, He proposed to the Joint Chiefs that he be allowed to use atomic bombs against Chinese troop concentrations and supply lines, a suggestion that appalled Truman, who feared not only the moral implications but also the possibility that such an action would bring Soviet nuclear retaliation. Then, on March 24, 1951, MacArthur committed the ultimate act of insubordination. Truman was preparing to announce a diplomatic initiative to seek a negotiated settlement to the war, a proposal that had been carefully coordinated with United Nations allies. Before Truman could make his announcement, MacArthur issued his own statement, delivered as a military communique but clearly intended as a political message, in which he threatened to expand the war into China and offered to meet with Chinese commanders personally to discuss surrender terms. This was not a military assessment. This was a general trying to make foreign policy, deliberately sabotaging his president's diplomatic efforts and demonstrating to the world that the United States government was divided against itself. Truman was livid. In his diary, he wrote that MacArthur's action was in open defiance of my orders as President and Commander-in-Chief, and he added, "This looks like the last straw. Rank insubordination." The final straw came on April 5, 1951, when Republican Congressman Joseph Martin read aloud on the floor of the House of Representatives a letter he had received from MacArthur. In the letter, dated March 20, 1951, MacArthur had responded to Martin's suggestion that nationalist Chinese forces should be used to open a second front against Communist China by writing, "It seems strangely difficult for some to realize that here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest, and that we have joined the issue thus raised on the battlefield. That here we fight Europe's war with arms while the diplomats there still fight it. With words, that if we lose the war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe is inevitable. Win it, and Europe most probably would avoid war and yet preserve freedom. As you pointed out, we must win. There is no substitute for victory." The letter directly contradicted stated administration policy, which held that Europe, not Asia, was the strategic priority for the United States. It openly criticized the president's limited war strategy, and it aligned MacArthur with the Republican opposition in Congress, transforming what should have been a military matter into a partisan political weapon. Truman faced an agonizing decision. Firing MacArthur would be enormously unpopular, would trigger a political firestorm, and would subject Truman to accusations of being soft on communism at the height of McCarthyism. But keeping MacArthur would establish the precedent that generals could publicly defy presidents, could make their own foreign policy, and could undermine civilian control of the military. Truman consulted with his closest advisers, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley. All of them, after initial hesitation, agreed that MacArthur had to go. Marshall, himself a five-star general and the most respected military figure in the country after MacArthur, told Truman bluntly, "The SOB should have been fired 2 years ago." On April 9, 1951, Truman made his final decision, and on April 10, 1951, he signed the order relieving MacArthur of all his commands. The announcement was supposed to be delivered to MacArthur through official military channels, but a leak to the press forced Truman to announce the firing at a press conference at 1 o'clock in the morning on April 11, 1951, to ensure that MacArthur would not hear about it first from radio reports. The statement Truman released was carefully crafted to avoid personal criticism of MacArthur, praising his military service while explaining that full and vigorous debate on matters of national policy is a vital element in the constitutional system of our free democracy, but that it is fundamental that military commanders must be governed by the policies and directives issued to them in the manner provided by our laws and Constitution. In other words, Truman was making it clear that this was not about MacArthur's military competence but about the constitutional principle that in a democracy, the military is subordinate to civilian authority. The reaction was explosive. Republicans in Congress called for Truman's impeachment. Senator Joseph McCarthy declared that the president's decision had been made while drunk on bourbon and Benedictine. The Chicago Tribune ran the headline, "Truman Fires MacArthur." Telegrams poured into the White House running 20-1 against Truman's decision. Gallup polls showed that 69% of Americans disapproved of the firing. In cities across the country, Truman was burned in effigy. The Los Angeles City Council adjourned for a day of mourning, as if a beloved leader had died. MacArthur's return to the United States after 14 years abroad was staged like a Roman triumph, with millions lining the streets to cheer him, with ticker-tape parades in San Francisco, in Washington, and in New York, and with an invitation to address a joint session of Congress, an honor rarely granted to military officers. Right now, at this exact midpoint in our story, we need you to think about what kind of courage it took for Truman to make this decision, knowing he would be vilified, knowing his presidency might not survive the backlash, and we need you to understand that this moment protected every generation that came after, so take a second right now to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Hit that like button to support this deep dive into real history. Share this video with someone who cares about democracy and constitutional government, and leave a comment about whether you think Truman made the right decision, because the confrontation was far from over and what MacArthur did next would determine whether civilian control of the military would survive. On April 19, 1951, Douglas MacArthur stood before Congress and delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history, a masterpiece of rhetoric that was broadcast on radio and television to millions of Americans. He spoke for 34 minutes without notes, his voice rising and falling with theatrical precision, painting himself as a loyal soldier who had been betrayed by politicians who lacked the will to win. He defended his strategy in Korea, arguing that war's very object is victory, not prolonged indecision, a clear rebuke to Truman's limited war approach. He criticized the administration's focus on Europe, insisting that Asia was the real battlefield in the struggle against communism. He presented himself as the voice of the common soldier, claiming to speak for the men fighting and dying in Korea who deserved leadership committed to victory. And he ended with one of the most memorable peroration in American oratory, quoting from an old barracks ballad that said, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," and then adding, "And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty." There was not a dry eye in the chamber. Republicans wept openly. Even some Democrats found themselves moved by the emotional power of MacArthur's performance. The speech seemed to confirm everything his supporters believed, that he was a patriot who had been stabbed in the back by small-minded politicians, that Truman had made a terrible mistake, and that MacArthur deserved to be president himself. In the days that followed, MacArthur continued his tour of America, giving speeches, attending banquets, receiving honors, and basking in adulation that seemed to confirm his belief in his own greatness. But then something remarkable happened, something that MacArthur had not anticipated and that would ultimately vindicate Truman's decision. The Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held joint hearings on MacArthur's dismissal and on American policy in the Far East, hearings that lasted from May 3, 1951, to June 25, 1951, and that heard testimony from MacArthur himself as well as from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from Secretary of Defense Marshall, and from Secretary of State Acheson. The hearings were closed to protect classified information, but transcripts were released daily to the press. MacArthur testified for 3 days, from May 3 through May 5, 1951, repeating his arguments for a more aggressive strategy and defending his conduct. But then, one by one, the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified, and they systematically dismantled MacArthur's case. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the last man to be promoted to 5-star rank, delivered the most devastating testimony on May 15, 1951, when he stated that MacArthur's strategy would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. Bradley explained that the Joint Chiefs unanimously believed that expanding the war into China would drain American resources from the defense of Europe, where the Soviet threat was far more dangerous, would risk Soviet intervention and possibly World War III, and would likely unite the Chinese people behind their communist government rather than weakening it. General J. Lawton Collins, Army Chief of Staff, testified that MacArthur had repeatedly ignored intelligence about Chinese intervention and had made serious strategic errors. General Hoyt Vandenberg, Air Force Chief of Staff, testified that bombing Chinese bases in Manchuria would require diverting nearly all American air power to Asia, leaving the United States vulnerable in Europe. Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations, supported his colleagues. Even more damaging to MacArthur's reputation was the revelation that he had not merely disagreed with policy but had actively worked to undermine it, had corresponded with political opponents of the president, and had publicly contradicted his commander-in-chief while American soldiers were dying in combat. As the hearings continued through May and into June of 1951, public opinion began to shift. Americans who had initially been outraged by MacArthur's firing started to understand the constitutional issues at stake. The spectacle of military leaders having to testify, having to explain and defend their decisions to civilian senators, reinforced the principle that Truman had been fighting for, that in America the military answers to elected officials, not the other way around. Newspaper editorials that had initially condemned Truman began to reconsider. Even some Republicans who had called for Truman's impeachment quietly backed away from that position. MacArthur's speeches, which had seemed so powerful in April, began to seem self-serving and grandiose in light of the testimony from respected military leaders who had worked with him and who contradicted his version of events. The old soldier, who was supposed to fade away, refused to fade, continuing to give political speeches and allowing his name to be promoted for the Republican presidential nomination in 1952, which further undermined his claim to be above politics. By the time the hearings concluded on June 25, 1951, the tide had turned. MacArthur's bid for the presidency went nowhere. Republican leaders concluded that he was too controversial to be their nominee, and he faded not into heroic legend but into increasing irrelevance, living the rest of his life in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, giving occasional speeches, writing his memoirs, and watching as history moved on without him. He died on April 5, 1964, at the age of 84, still convinced of his own rightness, still bitter about his dismissal, never fully understanding that Truman had been defending a principle more important than any military strategy. Truman, meanwhile, paid an enormous political price for his decision but never wavered in his belief that he had done the right thing. His approval ratings, already low before the firing, dropped even further. In March 1952, he announced that he would not seek re-election, knowing that he had become too unpopular to win. He left office in January 1953, returned to Independence, Missouri, with his wife Bess, lived modestly on his military pension because there was no presidential pension system at the time, and watched as Dwight Eisenhower, who had carefully avoided taking sides in the MacArthur controversy, became president. But history would judge Truman far more kindly than his contemporaries did. The principle he had defended, that civilian control of the military is non-negotiable in a democracy, became more firmly established in American political culture. Future presidents, when faced with insubordinate generals, could point to Truman's example. When John F. Kennedy clashed with his military advisors during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when Lyndon Johnson overruled General William Westmoreland's requests for more troops in Vietnam, when Barack Obama replaced General Stanley McChrystal in Afghanistan in June 2010 for making disparaging comments about civilian officials in a Rolling Stone article. The precedent was clear: generals serve at the pleasure of the president, and if they cannot support administration policy, their duty is to resign quietly, not to conduct public campaigns against their commander-in-chief. Truman had closed the door on military overreach, not by destroying MacArthur personally but by standing firm on constitutional principle even when it was politically suicidal to do so. The constitutional significance of Truman's decision cannot be overstated, because democracies throughout history have fallen when military leaders believed themselves entitled to make political decisions. In ancient Rome, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his legions in 49 BC and destroyed the Republic. In 20th century Japan, military leaders had taken control of government policy by the 1930s, leading the country into disastrous wars. In Latin America and Africa, military coups had become routine methods of changing government. The United States, by contrast, had maintained an unbroken tradition of civilian control since George Washington voluntarily resigned his military commission in 1783 and returned power to the Continental Congress. But that tradition was fragile and depended on leaders willing to defend it even at great personal cost. MacArthur's challenge was the most serious threat to civilian control in American history precisely because he was so popular, so accomplished, and so convinced that his military genius gave him the right to override political leadership. If Truman had backed down, if he had allowed MacArthur to remain in command despite his insubordination, the precedent would have been catastrophic. Future generals would have learned that they could defy presidents if they had sufficient public support. The balance of power enshrined in the Constitution, with the President as Commander-in-Chief and Congress as the body that declares war and appropriates funds, would have been fatally compromised. The American system of government might have evolved toward a model where the military became a political force in its own right, able to pressure civilian leaders and constrain their options. Truman prevented that future by firing MacArthur, by enduring the political backlash, and by trusting that history would vindicate his decision even if his contemporaries condemned it. The Korean War itself continued for more than 2 years after MacArthur's dismissal, finally ending in an armistice signed on July 27, 1953, that left Korea divided along roughly the same line where the war had begun, the 38th parallel. The armistice was not a victory in the sense that MacArthur had demanded, not a triumphant crushing of communist forces, but rather a negotiated settlement that achieved the limited objective of preserving South Korea's independence without expanding the conflict into World War III. More than 36,000 Americans died in the Korean War, along with hundreds of thousands of Koreans and Chinese, a terrible cost that led many Americans to question whether the war had been worth fighting at all. But the strategic objective that Truman and his advisors had pursued, containing communist expansion without triggering a global war, had been achieved. South Korea survived as an independent nation and would eventually become a thriving democracy and economic powerhouse, while North Korea remained a totalitarian nightmare. The policy of containment that Truman had applied in Korea would become the foundation of American strategy throughout the Cold War, a strategy of resisting communist expansion without resorting to nuclear war, and that strategy ultimately succeeded when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. MacArthur's alternative strategy, of seeking total victory through military escalation, might have produced different results in Korea, but at the risk of a nuclear conflict that could have killed millions and destroyed civilization itself. History suggested that Truman's judgment, though it seemed weak and indecisive to his critics in 1951, was ultimately wiser and more prudent than MacArthur's aggressive certainty. The personal aftermath for the two men illustrated the difference between seeking glory and serving principle. MacArthur lived for 13 more years after his dismissal, and they were years marked by increasing bitterness and irrelevance. He gave his famous Duty, Honor, Country speech at West Point on May 12, 1962, his last major public appearance, a speech that was moving and eloquent but that also revealed a man still living in the past, still viewing himself as a misunderstood hero. He rarely left his hotel suite, received visitors who wanted to hear his war stories, and brooded about the recognition he believed he deserved but never received. His funeral in 1964 was attended by presidents and generals, but the honors seemed more dutiful than heartfelt, a recognition of his undeniable military accomplishments but also an acknowledgment that his greatest ambitions had been thwarted. Truman, by contrast, lived for almost 20 years after leaving office, dying on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. He never became wealthy, never sought to profit from his presidency, lived in the same modest house in Independence that he had bought in the 1930s, and took daily walks around his neighborhood where ordinary citizens would greet him without fanfare. He established the Truman Presidential Library, which opened in 1957, where he would spend his days greeting visitors, signing books, and answering questions from students. He witnessed the transformation of his reputation from failed president to elder statesman, as historians began to reassess his accomplishments and recognize his courage in making difficult decisions, including the decision to fire MacArthur. When he died, the tributes focused not on military victories or dramatic speeches but on moral courage, on integrity, and on his unwavering commitment to democratic principles even when doing so was politically costly. The lessons of this confrontation extend far beyond the specific circumstances of the Korean War and the personalities of Truman and MacArthur, because every generation must relearn the fundamental principles of democratic governance, must resist the temptation to let crisis undermine constitutional order, and must find leaders willing to defend those principles even at great personal cost. In times of war or national emergency, there is always a temptation to defer to military expertise, to let generals make decisions that should be made by elected officials, to allow fear or urgency to override the slow deliberations of democracy. MacArthur represented that temptation in its most seductive form, a genuine military genius who could point to real accomplishments and who argued that he knew better than politicians how to win wars. But democracy cannot survive if it accepts the premise that expertise trumps accountability, that knowing how to win battles gives you the right to decide whether battles should be fought, or that generals are entitled to make foreign policy because they are the ones implementing it. The whole point of civilian control of the military is that decisions about war and peace are too important to be left to military professionals alone, that they involve moral and political judgments that must be made by officials who answer to the people through elections. Truman understood this instinctively, not because he was a military expert, he wasn't, but because he understood constitutional government and because he was willing to be unpopular in defense of principle. Today, more than 70 years after Truman fired MacArthur, the principle of civilian control of the military remains secure in the United States, but it requires constant vigilance and courageous leadership to maintain. The temptation to blur the lines between military and civilian authority persists, especially in an era when the United States has been engaged in continuous military operations for decades, when generals become public figures and media celebrities, and when the prestige of military service sometimes seems to grant special authority to speak on political matters. The tradition that Truman defended is strong but not unbreakable, and each generation of Americans must recommit to the principle that in a democracy, the people, through their elected representatives, decide when and how to use military force, and that generals, no matter how accomplished or popular, must accept the decisions of civilian leadership or resign their commissions. The alternative, the path that MacArthur represented, leads inexorably toward military government, where power flows from force rather than from consent, where expertise replaces accountability, and where the fundamental premise of democracy, that the people are sovereign, is gradually eroded until it disappears entirely. Truman closed the door on that possibility in April 1951, not through military victory or political maneuvering, but through the simple act of insisting that the Constitution means what it says, that presidents command generals and not the other way around, and that courage sometimes means doing the unpopular thing because it is the right thing. As we close this story, think about the kind of leadership that democracy requires: the willingness to be unpopular in defense of principle, the courage to stand against public opinion when constitutional values are at stake, and the wisdom to understand that some things are more important than personal popularity or political survival. So right now, before you click away, subscribe to this channel to support more deep investigations into the moments that shaped our world. Hit that like button. To help this video reach others who need to hear about real courage in leadership, share this with someone who cares about democracy and constitutional government, and leave a comment about what surprised you most in this story or what lessons you think we should take from Truman's decision, because the principle he defended, the idea that in America the military serves the people through their elected representatives, remains as vital today as it was on that April morning in 1951 when an unpopular president fired the most popular general in the country and, in doing so, protected American democracy for every generation that followed.